It was a regular Tuesday morning, just like any other. The little cafe on the corner was busy as always. People hurried in and out, grabbing their coffee and breakfast on their way to work or school. The smell of fresh coffee filled the air, mixing with the sound of soft music and the hum of chatter from the customers. Behind the counter, the barista worked quickly, trying to keep up with the orders. Tanya stood in line, waiting patiently for her turn. She was a quiet woman, always smiling but never drawing much attention to herself. Her dark brown eyes were warm, and her smile could light up a room, but she rarely spoke unless she had to. Tanya wasn't the kind of person who liked to be noticed. She liked to stay in the background, watching and listening. That's just who she was. On this particular morning, Tanya had decided to stop by the cafe before heading to work. She worked as a social worker, helping families who were going through tough times. It was a hard job, but she loved it because she cared deeply about people. Tanya always believed that everyone deserved kindness, no matter what. She wore a simple outfit, a plain blouse and slacks. Nothing fancy. She didn't carry a designer bag or wear expensive jewelry. To anyone looking at her, she seemed like just another customer, waiting in line for her coffee. But Tanya had a story that no one in that cafe knew. She had faced challenges in her life, more than most people could imagine. Those challenges had made her strong, even if she didn't always show it. The cafe was crowded that morning. People were rushing in and out, some chatting on their phones, others tapping their feet impatiently as they waited in line. Tanya didn't mind waiting. She stood quietly, her hands clasped in front of her, looking around at the busy scene. Behind her, a young woman in a business suit was tapping away on her phone. Ahead of her, an older man with a newspaper tucked under his arm was ordering a large black coffee. The barista greeted each customer with a friendly smile, though it was clear she was working hard to keep up with the line. Tanya's turn was coming up. She glanced at the menu above the counter, even though she already knew what she wanted: a medium latte with just a little sugar. It was her favorite drink, one that gave her a little boost before starting her day. Just as the older man moved aside with his coffee, Tanya stepped forward. But before she could speak, the door to the cafe swung open with a loud jingle. A tall man in a police uniform walked in. His boots clunked loudly on the tile floor as he made his way to the counter. He didn't wait in line. He didn't even glance at the people who were waiting. Instead, he walked straight to the front, cutting in front of Tanya and the other customers. The barista looked up, startled. She hesitated, her eyes darting to Tanya and then back to the officer. Tanya took a small step back, her calm smile still on her face. She didn't say anything. She didn't make a fuss. The officer ordered his coffee, his deep voice booming across the cafe. The barista nodded quickly, rushing to make his drink. No one in the cafe said a word. Some people looked at each other, raising their eyebrows, but no one spoke up. Tanya stayed quiet, too. She wasn't the type to cause a scene. But deep down, she couldn't help but feel a little frustrated. Was it so hard for people to wait their turn like everyone else? The officer leaned on the counter as he waited for his coffee, looking around the cafe as if he owned the place. His eyes swept over Tanya for just a second before moving on, not even giving her a second thought. To him, she was nobody. Just another person in the background. When the barista handed the officer his coffee, he turned quickly, not paying attention to where he was going. His arm brushed against Tanya, and the cup of hot coffee tipped. The coffee spilled all over Tanya's blouse, soaking it and leaving a big, dark stain. Tanya gasped as the hot liquid touched her skin. It wasn't scalding, but it was hot enough to make her wince. The officer barely glanced at her. "Watch where you're standing," he said gruffly, his voice cold and dismissive. He didn't apologize. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just acted like it was her fault, like she was in his way. The cafe went silent. Everyone was staring now, their eyes wide with shock. Some people looked like they wanted to say something, but no one did. The officer didn't seem to care. He just walked toward the door, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. Tanya stood there for a moment, holding a handful of napkins she had grabbed from the counter. Her blouse was ruined, the dark stain spreading across the fabric. She could feel the stares of the other customers, but she didn't look up. Instead, she quietly dabbed at the stain, trying to clean herself up as best as she could. Most people in her position might have gotten angry or shouted at the officer. But Tanya wasn't like most people. She didn't yell. She didn't make a scene. She just stood there, calm and quiet, her expression giving nothing away. But inside, Tanya felt a spark of something. It wasn't anger, exactly. It was something stronger. It was the feeling that came when she saw someone acting unfairly, using their power to treat others badly. It was the same feeling that had driven her to become a social worker in the first place. Tanya wasn't just another customer. She wasn't just another face in the crowd. And while the officer might not know it yet, he was about to find out exactly who she was. Tanya stood quietly in line, waiting her turn. She held her bag tightly and glanced at the menu, even though she already knew what she wanted: a warm cup of coffee to start her day. The cafe was lively, with the hum of voices, the clinking of cups, and the whirring of the coffee machine filling the air. People were busy chatting, typing on laptops, or scrolling through their phones. Tanya, as always, stayed calm and patient. Just as she stepped forward to order, the door to the cafe swung open with a loud jingle. In walked a tall, broad-shouldered man in a police uniform. His heavy boots made loud thuds on the tile floor as he walked toward the counter. His face was hard and serious, and his eyes darted around the room as if he was inspecting it. He looked like he was in charge and wanted everyone to know it. The officer didn't look at the line of customers. He didn't ask who was next. Instead, he walked straight to the counter, cutting in front of everyone, including Tanya. The barista, a young woman with curly hair tied back in a ponytail, froze for a moment. She glanced nervously at Tanya, who had clearly been next, and then back at the officer. "Move it, lady," the officer barked. His voice was loud and sharp, like a command. Tanya blinked but didn't say anything. She stepped aside quietly, her expression calm. But inside, she felt a small sting. The way he spoke to her was rude, almost like she didn't matter at all. Still, she chose to stay silent. She didn't want to cause any trouble. The officer leaned on the counter and ordered his coffee. The barista nodded quickly, fumbling with the cup and rushing to make his drink. Tanya watched silently as the officer acted like no one else in the cafe existed. People in the line exchanged glances, some looking annoyed, others simply shrugging as if this was normal. But no one said a word. When the barista handed the officer his coffee, he grabbed it carelessly and turned around. He didn't look where he was going, and as he moved, his arm bumped into Tanya. The hot coffee spilled out of the cup, splashing all over her blouse. Tanya gasped as the warm liquid soaked into her shirt. It wasn't scalding, but it was hot enough to make her flinch. She stepped back quickly, holding out her arms to keep the coffee from dripping onto her pants. The room went quiet. Every customer in the cafe turned to look at the scene. The officer glanced at Tanya for just a moment, his face showing no sign of regret. "Watch where you're standing," he said flatly, as if the accident was her fault. His voice was cold and dismissive, like she wasn't worth his time. Tanya looked at him, her eyes calm but steady. She didn't say anything. She didn't shout or complain. Instead, she reached for the stack of napkins on the counter and began dabbing at her blouse. The brown stain was spreading across the light-colored fabric, but she kept her movements slow and steady. The officer sneered, taking a sip of his coffee. "Maybe if you paid attention, you wouldn't be such a mess," he said with a smirk. His words were cruel, and the way he said them made it clear that he didn't care about what had just happened. The silence in the cafe grew heavier. Some customers looked at Tanya with sympathy, their eyes saying what their mouths didn't, "Are you okay?" Others avoided looking at her altogether, pretending nothing had happened. The barista stood behind the counter, frozen, her hands clutching a towel she had been using to clean. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. Still, Tanya didn't react. She simply continued to clean herself with the napkins, her expression calm and composed. But inside, she felt a mix of emotions: frustration, embarrassment, and something else. It wasn't anger, exactly, but it was close. It was the feeling she always got when she saw someone treating others unfairly. The officer didn't notice or didn't care how everyone in the room was watching him. He strutted toward the door, taking another sip of his coffee as he went. To him, the incident was over. He had his drink, and that was all that mattered. As the door closed behind him with another jingle, the noise in the cafe slowly returned. People started talking again, though their voices were quieter now. A few customers glanced at Tanya, some offering her small smiles of sympathy. The barista finally spoke. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice soft. "That was awful. Are you okay?" Tanya looked up and gave a small, polite smile. "I'm fine," she said gently. Her voice was calm, but there was a quiet strength in it. "It's just coffee." But deep down, Tanya knew it wasn't just coffee. It was about respect. It was about how people treat one another. And the officer's actions had shown her something important, something she couldn't ignore. As she finished cleaning herself, Tanya's mind began to turn. She thought about what had just happened, about the officer's behavior, and about how everyone else in the cafe had reacted. Most of them had stayed silent, just like she had. But Tanya wasn't just anyone. She wasn't the type of person to let things like this slide, even if she didn't show it right away. By the time Tanya walked out of the cafe, her blouse still damp from the coffee, she had made a decision. She wasn't going to let this moment pass without doing something. The officer might have walked away, thinking he was untouchable, but Tanya had a quiet power that he didn't know about. And soon, he would. The officer smirked, his chest puffed up like he was the most important person in the room. He walked with an air of confidence, as if his uniform made him untouchable. He didn't look back at Tanya, didn't say sorry, and certainly didn't seem to care about the coffee he had spilled all over her blouse. To him, she was just another person, someone he didn't have to respect. Tanya, however, stood still. Her hands rested at her sides, but her eyes followed the officer as he strutted toward the door. She didn't look angry. Her face was calm, but her gaze was steady. It was the kind of look that made people stop and wonder what she was thinking. And if the officer had taken a moment to notice, he might have felt a little less sure of himself. As he reached the door, Tanya's voice rang out. It was soft, but clear enough for everyone in the cafe to hear. "Officer," she said calmly, "do you always treat people like this?" The room fell silent again. A few heads turned toward Tanya, and some people glanced at the officer, waiting to see what he would do. He stopped in his tracks, his hand still on the door handle. Slowly, he turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice sharp. There was a hint of irritation in his tone, as if he didn't like being questioned. He stood tall, looking down at her with a smug expression. Tanya didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. Her movements were slow and deliberate, almost like she was giving him time to think about what she had said. She unlocked her phone and began typing, her fingers moving quickly over the screen. The officer scoffed, letting out a short, mocking laugh. "Go ahead," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Call whoever you want. Nobody's gonna care." He sounded so sure of himself, so confident that nothing Tanya could do would matter. But what the officer didn't know was that Tanya wasn't just an ordinary person. And she wasn't just texting anyone. Tanya looked up from her phone, her expression still calm. She didn't say a word, but there was something in her eyes that made the officer pause for a moment. It wasn't fear or anger. It was something else, something quiet but powerful. The officer shook his head and pushed the door open, stepping outside without another glance. He walked down the street, sipping his coffee like nothing had happened. The sound of his boots on the pavement faded as he disappeared around the corner. Back inside the cafe, Tanya put her phone back in her bag and straightened her shoulders. The barista, who had been watching the whole exchange, stepped closer. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Tanya gave a small nod. "I'm fine," she said simply. But there was a firmness in her voice that suggested she wasn't done with the matter. The barista hesitated. "That guy, he was so rude. I mean, he didn't even apologize." Tanya didn't respond right away. Instead, she picked up the napkins she had been using to clean her blouse and threw them in the trash. Then she turned to the barista and gave her a reassuring smile. "Sometimes people forget that respect is important," she said gently. "But it's never too late for them to learn." The barista tilted her head, as if trying to understand what Tanya meant. Before she could ask, Tanya walked to the door and stepped outside, leaving the cafe behind. Tanya's walk was unhurried, but her mind was busy. She thought about the officer's behavior, the way he had treated her and everyone else in the cafe. She thought about how he had used his position to act like the rules didn't apply to him. And she thought about how no one had spoken up, how everyone had just stood by and let it happen. But Tanya wasn't upset. She was focused. She knew that moments like this were opportunities, chances to make a difference, to stand up for what was right. And Tanya was not someone who let opportunities pass her by. As she walked, she opened her phone again and began scrolling through her contacts. She stopped at a name and tapped it, bringing up the number. It wasn't a friend or family member. It was someone she worked with, someone who could help her with what she had in mind. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "Hello." Tanya smiled slightly. "Hi, it's me, Tanya," she said. "I need a favor." The conversation was short, but when Tanya hung up, she felt a sense of calm. She had set something in motion, something the officer wouldn't see coming. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about making a scene. It was about accountability, about making sure that people in positions of power understood the weight of their actions. As she continued her walk, Tanya thought about the many times she had seen people like that officer, people who thought they could act however they wanted without facing any consequences. She had seen it in her work, in her community, and even in small moments like this one. But Tanya believed in the power of change. She believed that even small actions could lead to big results. Back at the cafe, the barista and the other customers were still talking about what had happened. Some people shook their heads, saying the officer's behavior was unacceptable. Others wondered aloud what Tanya had meant when she spoke to him. One man, who had been sitting in the corner with his laptop, said quietly, "I think she's going to do something about it." The barista looked at him. "You think so?" she asked. The man nodded. "Did you see her face? She's not the kind of person who lets things slide." And he was right. The next day began like any other at the police precinct. Officers were busy with their usual tasks, answering phones, writing reports, and discussing the day's assignments. Officer Brad strolled in confidently, his uniform crisp and his coffee in hand. He didn't think much about the events at the cafe the day before. To him, it had been just another ordinary day. But things were about to change. As Brad made his way to his desk, a young officer approached him. "Sergeant wants to see you in the meeting room," the officer said, avoiding Brad's eyes. Brad raised an eyebrow. "What's this about?" he asked, but the young officer just shrugged and walked away. With a grunt, Brad headed toward the meeting room, his boots clicking on the tiled floor. He pushed the door open, expecting to see his usual colleagues. Instead, he stopped in his tracks. Inside the room was a group of people he didn't recognize. They were sharply dressed in suits and carried folders and tablets. Their faces were serious, and their eyes locked on him as he entered. At the center of the group stood a woman, Tanya. She was no longer dressed in the simple blouse and slacks she had worn at the cafe. Today, she looked powerful and confident, her expression calm but firm. Brad's smirk faltered. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice louder than it needed to be. He glanced around the room, but no one answered. Tanya took a step forward. "Officer Brad," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Do you remember me from yesterday?" Brad froze. His mind raced as he tried to place her. Then it hit him, the woman at the cafe, the one he had dismissed so easily. His face turned pale. He stammered, his confidence slipping. "I think I do." Tanya didn't give him time to recover. "My name is Tanya Mitchell," she said, her tone unwavering. "I am the Director of Community Oversight for the city. I'm here because your actions yesterday were not just unprofessional, they violated the values of this department." Brad's jaw dropped. He tried to speak, but no words came out. The room felt like it was closing in on him. Tanya gestured to the team of people behind her. "We've reviewed the footage from the cafe," she continued. "We've also spoken to witnesses who confirmed your behavior. As an officer of the law, you are expected to treat every citizen with respect and fairness. What you did yesterday was the opposite of that." Brad's face turned red. "Look," he said quickly, "I didn't mean anything by it. It was just a misunderstanding." Tanya raised her hand, cutting him off. "This isn't about excuses," she said firmly. "This is about accountability." The room was silent. Brad looked around, hoping for support, but no one came to his defense. The people in suits simply watched him, their expressions unreadable. Tanya continued, her voice calm but full of authority. "Effective immediately, you are suspended, pending further investigation. This department does not tolerate behavior that disrespects or harms the community we are sworn to serve." Brad's eyes widened. "Suspended? You can't be serious," he blurted out. "I've been an officer for 15 years. You're going to ruin my career over some spilled coffee?" Tanya's gaze didn't waver. "This isn't about the coffee, Officer Brad," she said. "This is about how you treat the people you serve. Your behavior yesterday showed a lack of respect, and that is unacceptable. This department is built on trust, and you've broken that trust." Brad tried again. "I was having a bad day." "Everyone has bad days." Tanya didn't budge. "Bad days don't excuse bad actions," she said simply. "As an officer, you are held to a higher standard. You took an oath to protect and respect this community. Yesterday, you failed to live up to that oath." The tension in the room was heavy. Brad looked around again, but the faces staring back at him offered no sympathy. He realized, for the first time, that he wasn't in control of the situation. Tanya stepped forward, her voice softening slightly but still firm. "This isn't just about punishment, Officer Brad. This is about making things right. Everyone makes mistakes. But the question is, what will you do to fix them?" Brad opened his mouth to respond, but he didn't know what to say. His usual confidence had been replaced by uncertainty. Tanya didn't wait for an answer. You'll have time to think about that during your suspension, she said. She turned to the others in the room. Let's wrap this up. As the meeting ended, Brad was left standing alone in the room, his mind spinning. He had always thought he was untouchable, that his uniform gave him power over everyone else. But now, for the first time, he felt small. Meanwhile, Tanya walked out of the precinct with her team. She didn't feel triumphant or victorious. This wasn't about winning, it was about doing what was right. She knew that her actions today might not change Officer Brad overnight, but they were a step toward accountability. As she stepped outside into the bright morning sun, Tanya thought about the people in the cafe, the ones who had watched silently as the officer dismissed her. She hoped they would hear about what had happened today. Maybe it would remind them that everyone has the power to stand up for what's right, even in small moments. And as for Brad, Tanya hoped he would take this experience as a lesson, a chance to change. Because respect isn't something you demand with a uniform. It's something you earn through your actions. Officer Brad walked out of the precinct, his head down and his shoulders slumped. Two other officers escorted him, their faces blank, giving him no comfort. The precinct, which had always been a place of pride for him, now felt like a walk of shame. The chatter of his colleagues faded behind him as the heavy door closed, and he stepped out into the bright sunlight. Inside the precinct, Tanya stood in front of the remaining officers. The room was silent, all eyes on her. Some officers looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, while others sat still, their expression serious. Tanya held her ground, her calm but firm presence filling the room. Respect and dignity are not optional in this profession, Tanya began. Her voice was steady, and though she wasn't shouting, everyone could hear her clearly. If you wear this badge, you represent everyone in this community, not just the ones you choose to respect. She let her words hang in the air for a moment, giving everyone time to absorb them. Every person who walks through our streets, enters our buildings, or lives in our neighborhoods deserves to be treated with kindness and fairness. It doesn't matter who they are, what they look like, or where they come from. Some officers nodded slightly, while others kept their eyes on their desks, avoiding her gaze. Tanya continued, her voice growing softer but no less powerful. Being a police officer is not about power. It's about service. And that service must come with compassion and humility. Without those things, this badge means nothing. She stepped back, letting her final words sink in. Change starts with each of us, she said. And it starts now. After Tanya left the room, the officers sat quietly for a moment. Some exchanged glances, while others remained deep in thought. Her words had struck a chord, reminding them of the responsibility they carried every day. Word of what had happened spread quickly, not just through the precinct, but across the city. People in the cafe who had witnessed the officer's rude behavior were the first to share the story. They told their friends, co-workers, and neighbors about the quiet woman who had stood up for respect and fairness. She didn't yell or make a scene, one woman said. She just stayed calm and handled it like a real leader. Another patron added, it's about time someone stood up to people who think they can get away with treating others poorly. Social media posts began popping up, with people sharing the story and praising Tanya for her courage. Comments flooded in, with many saying how inspiring it was to see someone hold an officer accountable for their actions. This is the kind of leadership we need, one comment read. Respect goes both ways, no matter who you are. Back at the precinct, the department took Tanya's words to heart. Meetings were held, and plans were made to ensure that incidents like this wouldn't happen again. A new training program was introduced, focusing on community respect and understanding. Officers were taught how to communicate better, listen more, and treat everyone with dignity, no matter the situation. The chief of police stood in front of the department one morning and addressed the changes. This is not just about one incident, he said. This is about making our department better. It's about earning the trust of the people we serve. And we can only do that by showing them the respect they deserve. The new training sessions weren't easy. Some officers grumbled, saying they already knew how to do their jobs. But as the sessions went on, many began to see things differently. They listened to stories from community members, watched videos, and had honest discussions about respect and fairness. Slowly but surely, a shift began to take place within the department. Meanwhile, Tanya returned to her regular work. She didn't seek attention or praise for what she had done. Her focus remained on the families and individuals she worked with every day, helping them through difficult times and making their voices heard. When asked about the incident at the cafe, Tanya would smile politely and say, "It wasn't about me. It was about what was right." Tanya's quiet determination continued to inspire those around her. Her co-workers admired her strength and kindness, often seeking her advice. Community leaders reached out to her, asking for her help in creating programs that could build stronger connections between the police and the neighborhoods they served. One day, Tanya received an email from a teacher at a local school. The teacher explained that her students had heard about Tanya's actions and wanted to learn more about respect and fairness. She asked if Tanya would come speak to the class. Tanya agreed, and a week later, she stood in front of a classroom full of bright-eyed children. She shared her story in simple words, explaining how important it was to treat everyone with kindness, no matter who they were. Even when people are unkind to you, it's important to stay calm and stand up for what's right, she told them. Respect is something we give to others, and it's something we all deserve in return. The students listened closely, and when Tanya finished, a young girl raised her hand. "Do you think that officer will be nicer now?" she asked. Tanya smiled. "I hope so," she said. "Sometimes, people just need to learn. And when they do, they can change." Over time, the effects of Tanya's actions were felt throughout the community. The cafe where it all started became a symbol of change. The barista, who had been so shaken by the incident, now felt more confident in standing up for herself and others. Regular customers talked about how important it was to treat everyone with fairness, and the cafe staff made it a point to create a welcoming environment for all. As for Officer Brad, his suspension gave him time to reflect. At first, he had been angry and defensive, blaming everyone but himself. But as the days passed, he began to think about Tanya's words. He realized that she hadn't been trying to ruin his career, she had been trying to remind him of what it meant to be a police officer. When Brad returned to work, he was different. He listened more and spoke less. He treated people with more patience and care. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a start. And for Tanya, that was enough. Tanya's story became a quiet reminder to everyone in the city: respect isn't something you demand. It's something you show through your actions. And when one person stands up for what's right, it can create a ripple effect that touches countless lives. Sometimes, the strongest people are not the loudest. They don't shout, and they don't try to scare others with big words or angry voices. They are quiet, but their actions speak louder than anything they could ever say. Tanya was one of those people. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't yell or argue. But what she did had more power than any loud words ever could. Tanya wasn't just standing up for herself that day in the cafe. She was standing up for everyone who had ever felt small, ignored, or disrespected. She was standing up for the people who had been made to feel invisible, like their feelings didn't matter. And she showed them and the world that they do matter. When Tanya looked at Officer Brad that day in the precinct, she wasn't thinking about revenge. She wasn't trying to embarrass him or make him feel bad just for the sake of it. What she wanted was justice. And justice doesn't come from shouting or fighting. Justice comes from doing what is right, even when it's hard. Tanya didn't have to say much to make a big impact. Her calm voice and steady action said everything that needed to be said. She didn't just show the officer what respect looks like, she reminded everyone watching that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn by how you treat people. After that day, Tanya went back to her normal life. She didn't seek fame or attention for what she had done. She wasn't interested in being called a hero. For Tanya, doing the right thing was just part of who she was. She believed that when you see something wrong, you have a choice: you can ignore it, or you can try to make it better. Tanya always chose to make it better. Her actions inspired so many people. The cafe staff, the other customers, the police department, everyone who heard her story began to think about how they could be better. They started to ask themselves important questions: am I treating others with kindness? Am I showing respect to everyone, not just the people I like or agree with? The truth is, respect isn't just about saying please and thank you. It's about seeing people for who they are and treating them with dignity. It's about understanding that everyone has feelings, everyone has a story, and everyone deserves to be treated fairly. Tanya's story also showed that even small actions can lead to big changes. At first, standing up to Officer Brad might have seemed like a small thing. But it wasn't. Her courage set off a chain reaction. It made the police department rethink how they train their officers. It made people in the community feel like their voices mattered. And it reminded everyone that change starts with one person who is brave enough to speak up. It's easy to think that one person can't make a difference. But Tanya proved that this isn't true. One person can make a difference. You don't need to be famous. You don't need to have a lot of money or power. All you need is the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. And sometimes, standing up doesn't mean shouting or making a big scene. Sometimes, it's as simple as saying, "This isn't okay," or, "I deserve respect." Sometimes, it's about staying calm and letting your actions show the kind of person you are. That's what Tanya did, and it changed everything. Tanya's story is a reminder for all of us. It reminds us that respect isn't about having a fancy title or a powerful job. It's not about being the loudest or the strongest. Respect comes from how we treat others. It comes from kindness, fairness, and understanding. And it's not just about how we treat the people we like. True respect means treating everyone with dignity, even the people we don't agree with or understand. Because at the end of the day, we are all human. We all want to feel seen, heard, and valued. Sometimes, we might feel like our voices are too small to matter. We might think, "What can I do? I'm just one person." But Tanya's story teaches us that every voice matters. Every small act of kindness, every moment of standing up for what's right, it all adds up. You don't have to be perfect to make a difference. You just have to care enough to try. Whether it's standing up for someone who's being treated unfairly, speaking kindly to someone who's having a bad day, or simply showing respect to everyone you meet, you have the power to create change. Tanya's actions also remind us of the power of hope. She didn't let the officer's rude behavior ruin her day. She didn't let it make her angry or bitter. Instead, she used it as an opportunity to make things better for herself and for others. That's what real strength looks like. It's not about being the loudest or the toughest. It's about staying true to your values, even when it's hard. And that's why Tanya's story is so powerful. It's a story about justice, but it's also a story about hope, kindness, and courage. It shows us that even when things seem unfair, we have the power to make a difference. We just have to believe in ourselves and in the goodness of others. So the next time you see someone being treated unfairly, think about Tanya. Remember her quiet strength, her calm voice, and her unwavering belief in what's right. Let her story inspire you to stand up, speak out, and make a difference. Because sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who speak softly but carry a deep sense of justice. Tanya proved that real strength doesn't come from power or loudness. It comes from kindness, fairness, and the courage to do what's right. and she reminded us all of one simple truth: respect isn't given by power, it's earned by actions.